Good afternoon, everyone. It's such a joy to be able to support this convening, and I wish I could be with you today in person, but I'm honored to welcome you all to this exciting webinar from my incredible colleagues at Vote Solar titled Solar-Powered Optimism, Building a Brighter, Resilient Future. I am Sach Constantine, Vote Solar's Executive Director, and I'm delighted for you to hear from our incredible panel of Vote Solar staff who will share their insights on energy justice, equitable clean energy solutions, and the many reasons to be optimistic about the future of clean energy. This webinar is both for those who have known about Vote Solar and our work and those who may not. For those of you that are new, Vote Solar is a 501c3 nonprofit policy advocacy organization with the mission to realize a 100% clean energy future through a solutions-driven, people-first approach. We advance clean energy policy in legislatures and public commissions across the United States, and we do most of our work at the state level, where the majority of energy decisions are made. Our expertise comes from a deep understanding of the legislative process, regulatory interventions, and the ability to identify and accelerate solar solutions. We know that solar needs to serve and include everyone. And so here at Vote Solar, we are committed to building a more inclusive and equitable path to 100% clean energy. We rely on the support from our community to enable our work, and we must be adept at building bridges to communities with a stake in our clean energy future and bringing diverse stakeholders together to forge inclusive coalitions and winning campaigns. So we work in partnership with community-based organizations to identify and address previous inequities and rebuild in a way that benefits those historically left out of the energy decision-making process, including frontline communities, low-wealth communities, and communities of color. We advocate for energy justice at state and local governments and in regulatory proceedings, and so far this year alone, we have undertaken 30 legislative campaigns across 11 states. Our campaigns include advocating for electricity reliability in Michigan, especially concerning during winter storms and the resulting blackouts, for Minnesota to commit to 100% clean energy, which they did, and for reduced energy costs for Duke Energy customers in South Carolina. Despite setbacks and hardships, this work will lead to over 605,000 new solar jobs, 3.4 billion in public health cost benefits, and the equivalent of 11.3 million cars off the road. We are so excited you joined us today for our Earth Month webinar, and as we celebrate the Earth this April, it's essential for us to take a moment to reflect on the environmental and social justice movements that brought us to this time and place. Across the country, Black, Indigenous, and people of color, disabled, queer, and low-wealth communities have been on the front lines of environmental pollution, exposure to toxins, and many other injustices. Like the activists in Warren County, North Carolina, who in the 80s fought against a landfill, many communities have since protested and organized against companies and governments harming their homes. These early campaigns established the environmental justice movement and provided a roadmap for communities across the country to successfully advocate for access to clean air, water, energy, and land. But the work is far from over. In celebration of Earth Month, our panelists will speak to some of these early movements, discuss their current work in advocating for climate and energy justice, and why they are optimistic about the future of clean energy. First speaking today will be Andrea Leon Grossman. Andrea is the Deputy Program Director for Vote Solar in the West, advocating for equitable, clean, renewable energy policies and helping elevate community efforts, calling for a rapid and just transition. Before joining Vote Solar, Andrea was the Climate Action Director with ASUL, an environmental justice organization working with the Latinx community to protect and preserve our coasts and oceans. She co-led the coalition to stop the for-profit Brookfield Poseidon desalination plant in Southern California, which would have eroded Californians' human water rights. From Andrea, we will go to Yara Marin. Yara is the Interior West Regional Director for Vote Solar. She brings years of experience in community organizing and comprehensive political and civic engagement efforts. She has also led significant local, state, and federal campaigns around democracy, voting rights, immigration, and environmental justice, all centered on amplifying the voices of BIPOC communities. After Yara, we will hear from John Delury. As the Deputy Program Director for the Midwest, John coordinates campaigns for Vote Solar's legislative and regulatory priorities throughout that region. Before joining Vote Solar, John helped build low-income solar programs for solar companies. He has experience coordinating grassroots advocacy efforts for the Sierra Club and voter turnout initiatives for electoral candidates. The fourth speaker we will hear from today is Elena Weissman. Elena coordinates Vote Solar's campaigns in the Northeast, advocating for inclusive and equitable solar policies throughout the region. Prior to joining Vote Solar, Elena spent 6 years working in criminal justice reform, most recently as the director of the Bronx Freedom Fund, a community bail fund in New York City. And our final panelist today is Lindsay Halleck. Lindsay is the Southeast Deputy Program Director at Vote Solar, and prior to this role, she was the Director of Public and Environmental Policy at Cape Fear Public Utility Authority, where she led the organization's efforts on rate equity and affordability initiatives and on planning for climate change. I am confident that today's conversation will leave you feeling inspired and energized about the future of clean energy, and I want to thank our expert speakers and all of you for joining us today. Let's get started.
Thank you, Sash, for that wonderful message. We're going to start the presentation with Andrea.
Thank you, Emerald, and thank you for that wonderful introduction. It's wonderful to be with you all today. I am joining from Los Angeles, unceded territory of the Tonga and Gabrielino. So climate justice in California. Next slide, please. So in Southern California, we actually have the biggest urban oil field in the nation. And if you look at the CalEnviro screen in the next slide, you can see how in Southern California, we have high unemployment, pollution burden, high poverty rates, and also high rates of asthma and other health impacts. Now, on the next slide, when you see that interposed with the oil drilling, you see how directly interconnected are basically pollutants and all this dirty energy that is being extracted from our communities and affecting low wealth communities and people of color. And on the next slide, you'll see one of the latest marches that we had in protest against an expansion of a refinery, because we don't deserve this type of energy that is hurting us and even killing us. But the good news, as you can see on the next slide, is that we do have the solution to go 100% renewable energy. And it's really exciting to share this with you. With Vote Solar, we had many wins lately. And one of them is community solar is gaining momentum and popularity here in California. One of them is one of the programs that we had is with DWP, as they have a community solar for renters and those who live in multi-unit buildings. And that means that people can sign up and get this type of rates, and they get locked in a 10-year program. And that means that their rates will not go up in those 10 years. And if they move, they can actually move those rates with them as long as they stay within DWP. Next slide, please. Also, last year, we got the Solar App Plus legislation, and that basically what it does is it expedites solar applications, and that was a program through the Department of Energy that can help cities and municipalities permit solar on rooftop quicker, and the state has money to support cities in setting up new programs and with grants. And Vote Solar has been working with partners from Solar Right Alliance and California Solar Storage Alliance to get the word out about this amazing program. And again, just expediting the solar permits that basically are going to help us meet our climate goals sooner. Next slide, please. Also, in terms of microgrids, we're making progress. And while the program is still not up to what we want to see it, we're making, again, progress enormously. The Microgrid Equity Coalition ideally wanted something bigger, but it shows momentum. And from the state in support of this type of microgrids, particularly in areas facing shutoffs from wildfires and other grid issues. We're working to support our partners in their work to expand access to microgrids. We need to reclaim our power and also working with APEN. And with that, I'm going to pass it on to Yara.
Thank you, Andrea, and welcome everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. So I wanted to actually get started by giving us a brief overview of environmental justice efforts in the Interior West. And so in order to do so, we have to really go back all the way to the 1940s and look at Navajo Nation's environmental activism. And in the 1940s, when the US government began a mining program in Navajo territory. And so this led to a higher incidence of cancer and other diseases among the Navajo people as a result of radiation. However, it wasn't until the 1970s that community members began organizing to demand environmental justice. And in 1979, a dam used to store radioactive waste from uranium mines on Navajo land broke, spilling over 1,000 tons of radioactive material in the surrounding environment. And so this disaster is also known as the Church Rock spill. And it was also the largest release of radioactive material in US history. It contaminated the Rio Puerco and affected the drinking water of thousands of Navajo people, as well as damaging their crops and their livestock. This disaster spurred the Navajo people to demand greater environmental protections and to fight against environmental racism. They began organizing themselves and protesting against the uranium industry and other corporations that also polluted their lands and water. And in 1986, the Navajo Nation passed the Natural Resources Protection Act, which provided greater protections for Navajo lands and resources. And so since then, Navajo Nation, indigenous communities, and other environmental groups have continued to fight for environmental justice. And so this is, just one of many examples of how communities can come together to demand justice and to fight against environmental racism. Next slide, please. So I want to fast forward to current events and give you all a few updates on where we are and what we're working on here at Vote Solar to push the Interior West to a clean energy future. And so last week, the American Lung Association released their 2023 State of the Air report. And so some things to note, here is a list of the top 10 most polluted cities in the country by ozone, right? And so the top 10 most polluted cities in the country are on the West Coast. That's for a lot of different reasons, right? Air pollution stems from the wildfires that continue to burn across the West Coast. High ozone days also spike particle pollution related to heat. And so that's, a few of the reasons why a lot of the countries or the cities, in the West Coast are considered one of the most polluted. Also, people of color are 3.7 times more likely than white people to live in a country with failing grades. And more than 1 in 3 Americans live in places with unhealthy levels of air pollution. And so while more than 1 in 3 people, which is nearly 120 million people, live in counties that had unhealthy levels of ozone or particle pollution, I do want to note that that number is actually fewer people than last year's report. Next slide, please. So moving on to a more positive note, while the results and the reports might feel a little alarming and a little scary, I do want to stay hopeful and mention that here at Vote Solar, we are working to continue to be a bridge and to educate communities and partners about utility resource planning processes and opportunities to get involved. And so in the Southwest, building new solar energy resources is cheaper than continuing to operate existing coal plants. Next slide, please. So here you can see Tucson Electric Power and Pacific Corp's integrated resource plans. Their Pacific Corp in 2023 is including, over 9,000 megawatts of new wind, over 8,000 megawatts of storage, over almost 8,000 megawatts of new solar resources. And so I think while we are not where we want to be, we are seeing that utilities are building massive amount of clean energy resources, which is very exciting. Next slide, thank you. Utilities are also accelerating retirement of fossil fuels plants. And so the Navajo generating station was closed in 2020, and the San Juan generating station was closed in 2022. I do want to note that it's crucial that as we continue to close generating stations, that we center community and worker voices through community stakeholder engagement and collaborative planning processes to ensure an equitable and just energy transition. Next slide, please. So, as specific to Arizona, last year, Salt River Project, also known as SRP, Arizona's second largest electric utility, proposed a plan to double the size of their Coolidge generating station by adding 16 new gas units, which would have been a total of 820 megawatts of new gas, right? So really promising decades of fossil fuel production and pollution. And so the Randolph Community Center near this generating station is a historically Black neighborhood that already suffer from decades of environmental injustices in their neighborhood. Next slide. Ultimately, the Arizona Corporation Commission voted 4-1 in the best interest of SRP's customers and all Arizonans when it denied the approval of SRP's proposal. And this was a result and commitment of organizing, of the commitment of the Randolph residents who commuted hours on buses to downtown Phoenix, who took time out of their days, who asked for time off of their work to attend an open meeting and to say enough is enough. So in the last few months, we've also joined our partners across the region in participating in environmental justice days, environmental lobby days at the legislature, and engaging in conversations with legislators, with partners, and with community members around climate change, energy justice, the environmental justice, and the rapid deployment of distributed energy resources. And last but not least, Vote Solar, along with 28 of our Arizona coalition partners, met with the Governor's Office of Resiliency. And so the Governor's Office of Resiliency has just been reinstated as of a few weeks ago. And we discussed our community priorities, offered support to the Governor's Office of Resiliency's efforts, and are really excited to address, right, how to secure Arizona's water supply, advancing our clean energy economy, how to address the disparities faced between BIPOC and low wealth neighborhoods, and ensuring that we're pushing forward robust community outreach and education programs around distributed energy resources, solar storage, and the rapid deployment of electrical vehicles and electrical vehicle infrastructure. And so I'm really hopeful about the future of clean energy in the interior West. I think there's ample opportunities to maximize on federal funding and to ensure that we're pushing forward robust community outreach and education, that we're creating spaces for communities that are often left on the sidelines to join and to be a part of, driving the solutions and driving the transition to a clean energy future. And so we're really excited here at Vote Solar to continue conversations and ensure that legislative and regulatory arenas foster equity and inclusion at every touch point. Thank you.
Hey, everybody. This is John Lurie calling in from Chicago, land of the Council of Three Fires. I use he, him pronouns, and this is the mighty Midwest. Lindsay, I did you see a hand? Did you have a question? Okay. So I'm going to give a quick overview of our 3 priority states in the Midwest. We do work in a couple other states as well, but we're going to talk a little bit about Illinois, a little bit about Michigan, and a little bit about Minnesota. So if you can go to the next slide there. So I think a lot of places claim to be sort of the birthplace of the environmental justice movement, which I think is indicative of all of the environmental injustice we've seen throughout the country and throughout the history of this nation. But I did want to lift up one person and one organization in particular, which is Hazel Johnson. Back in the 80s, she got her hands on some data around cancer clusters in her neighborhood, Altgeld Gardens, which is a public housing authority in the south side of Chicago, and realized that her neighbors were getting sick and that they were getting sick a lot more frequently and a lot more severely than other parts of the state or even of the city. And so with this rich history of environmental justice movements and organizations, we have these community-based organizations and these frontline organizations that know what the solutions are, but are very often divorced from the process of building those solutions, from the legislative negotiations, from the regulations that implement those bills and those laws. And we decided to do things a little bit differently in Illinois a couple of years ago. So we sat down to begin this process of listening to communities all across the state to ensure that we weren't recreating the mistakes of the fossil fueled past while we're building the equitable clean energy future. And through that process, a new bill called the Climate and Equitable Jobs Act was ultimately born. And in those 956 pages, you can see where these programs and these policies that do support equitable workforce development or contractor development or deployment of renewable energy in ways that reduces energy burdens and energy costs, you can trace those back to individual people in this photo, especially folks that were representing frontline communities and had their voices heard. Unfortunately, in Illinois, we all lockstep and had this rallying cry, no climate, no equity, no deal. And we held that line until the very end, flexed some political power, and managed to pass what we believe is the most equitable climate justice package in the country. And our team has set out to implement that and ensure that everything stays on the rails there, including a whole bevy of new workforce development programs. Joe, I saw your question in the chat and I can address it in writing later. Next slide, please. Michigan has a similarly long story of injustice that has bred and born these tremendous place-based organizations. 2 that I wanted to highlight was Solidarity and We Want Green Too. They're both based in the Detroit area. And I will just very quickly tell Solidarity's story. Their power was just cut off, right? They were plunged into darkness by the utility company because the city had not paid their bills because of historic disinvestment, white flight, and deindustrialization. And so Solidarity just set out and they started doing solar paneled streetlights in Highland Park, Michigan, sort of engulfed by Detroit, in the Detroit area. These groups have maintained that focus on finding those equitable clean energy solutions. And we've started to find ways of partnering with them in our work in Michigan. So we worked with these 2 incredibly courageous organizations to actually model what it would look like to solve energy burden, to build towards energy justice through rooftop solar and behind the meter storage. So at the residential level, what if we just started giving people solar panels and batteries and started to subsidize that and pay for that as needed so that people weren't having to pay 15, 20% of their salary just to keep the lights on. We also started to look at how we focus those batteries to protect the healthcare vulnerable. So who is most reliant on power? It doesn't affect us all equally, right? If I lose power, I tend to be okay. I can float by, I can work with a neighbor to find some degree of resilience. Some people, it's truly life or death. And so deploying those batteries, figuring out what that would look like is a big piece of what we've been doing. And it's been in tandem with these place-based organizations. We can go over to Minnesota. So Minnesota, as Sach mentioned at the beginning, is the latest member of the 100% crew. So in February, it became the 23rd state plus District of Columbia to commit to 100% carbon-free energy. And while we rode that wave and got excited along with a bunch of our partners, we also recognized that a lot of our partners didn't see everything they wanted in that bill. There were things left on the table, not just that there are certain elements of how carbon-free is defined that might be problematic to some groups, but also we didn't really spell out how we get to 100%. And the how really matters, right? We have the what, 100%, we have the when, 2040, but we don't have anything in the books to guarantee that that path to 100% is going to be equitable. So we're still there in St. Paul. We're still working with the state legislature to try to pass a lot of additional bills that will spell out, like, what does it look like to support schools in lower wealth communities or environmental justice communities in going solar? How do we increase the incentives for income qualified households? And how do we reform community solar so that it actually reduces those energy burdens and helps people pay their bills? And so we stick around. I think it's something that our partners appreciate in us, that we don't just pass the thing and walk away. We are there for the implementation of these initiatives to ensure that they stay just and equitable on the road to 100%. And I'll wrap up there, pass it off. Thank you. Right, these are a collection of photos that I'll skip for lack of time, but this is our team in action, roaming around the Midwest, doing what we can to fight for climate justice.
All right. Hi, everybody. I'm Elena Weissman. I'm the Northeast Regional Director. I'm dialing in from Somerville. And I'm going to cover at Vote Solar, the Northeast and Mid-Atlantic are one region encompassing many states. Our most active from south to north are New Jersey, Pennsylvania, New York, and Massachusetts. And I'll try to cover all of those. So we have a lot to go through. I'm basically going to share some environmental justice history from each of these states and how that's carried over into our work today. And I'll highlight some ongoing fights that we're really honored and hopeful to be a part of. So just to give some context about the region, there are two trends that I wanted to highlight. One is that the region has a really deeply felt history of segregation. To give an example, school segregation is the most extreme in the Northeast. The Northeast has the highest Black and white segregation in the whole country. And what this leads to is some really extreme geographic dichotomies when it comes to the impact of pollution and of climate change risks, and generally of environmental justice overall. And some of the most segregated cities in the United States are in the Northeast. So what the divide means across the region is that low-income and BIPOC residents live closer to polluting sources, have less access to green space, and have higher rates of pollution-borne and exacerbated illnesses like asthma. And I'll also note that the region has the oldest housing stock in the nation. There's drafty houses, they're hard to weatherize, energy bills are really high, and similar to across the country, energy burdens are felt disproportionately by low-income people of color. It also means that with old roofs, it's hard to install rooftop solar. We have a really high difference between average rent and mortgage payments. It's hard for people to own a home. So there's lower rates of low-income home ownership for installations anyway. Go to the next slide. So to just touch on a couple of things about New York, the state has a really rich environmental justice history that dates back to the origins of the environmental justice movement in the 80s. And so there's also a lot of environmental history that we don't have enough time to go into. A lot of it is focused on post-Hurricane Sandy resilience work. What I'm going to talk about is something a little bit more recent, which is the 2009 Historic Climate Law, the CLCPA, the Climate Leadership and Community Protection Act. We'll talk about its influence and its next steps, and a lot of that has come to define our work in New York. And I know that New York State is much bigger than New York City, but I just put that on here because the city is bigger than a lot of states that we work on, and it does dominate a lot of the environmental work in the state. So in the 80s and 90s, two of our key EJ partners that are still working today, WEACT and NEJA, they were founded. They were working on air quality monitoring and other initiatives in their neighborhood, and WEACT specifically is in West Harlem. They both were also at the first multinational EJ gathering in DC, where the EJ principles were first adopted. And I wanted to highlight them because they're some of the same groups that were behind this historic climate law, the CLCPA, that was signed in 2019, and it put New York on a path towards zero emissions electricity by 2040. We were involved in that, and we continue to advocate for its implementation now. And the one thing I want to highlight from the CLCPA is that it also mandates that 40% of the benefits of clean energy and efficiency spending be driven to what the state calls disadvantaged communities. And also that accompanying efforts to curb pollution be focused on those same communities. And the process for defining what a disadvantaged community is was very inclusive, years long. They just completed their work, and these EJ groups that I mentioned were a part of that effort to come up with a definition too. And it was a key influence for the Justice 40 work at the federal level. Go to the next slide. One trend that I just wanted to highlight that is felt across the region is cumulative impact assessment. So these are studies that grow out of the recognition that BIPOC and low-income communities bear a disproportionate amount of the pollution burden and the accompanying health dangers that come with that, like asthma, and acknowledge that this is compounded by other socioeconomic burdens that have come from decades of disinvestment in the same communities. So there's a few states in the region that have passed laws requiring the consideration of cumulative impacts when considering granting a permit to a potentially polluting facility. So New Jersey did it first. It was something that was first introduced in the 90s, again, with key EJ partners that have been working on it since then and who we still partner with today. It finally passed in 2020, and then, not to be outdone, New York passed a similar law last year in 2022. They both apply to, they have different definitions of which communities these impact assessments need to happen in. So that's notable and worth kind of understanding the differences in definition. And Massachusetts is working on something similar now relating to citing polluting facilities as well. And you can go to the next slide for Massachusetts, and actually the one after that too. There are a lot of kind of local fights going on right now. I'll just highlight one thing on the note of cumulative impacts and citing. There's a proposal to install a substation in East Boston, and a huge amount of community backlash against this substation. And this is something that's happening in New Jersey too, where these facilities are trying to sort of like fast track a permit and undermine the spirit of different laws and policies that are supposed to prevent them from coming into overburden and environmental justice pollutions and communities. Something interesting about these different definitions that the states have in terms of who to focus on in terms of driving benefits and having extra precautions. Massachusetts also has a new definition of EJ populations, environmental justice populations, that now includes 50% of the state population as living in one. So many find that to be an issue. That's still sort of an ongoing conversation, and one that impacts the equity provisions that come in with the implementation of our climate law in Massachusetts, the 2050 roadmap law. And then the last slide, if you can move on to that, is just looking ahead at some of our priorities. So echoing what John and Yara said about the need for really strong implementation, a lot of our work in New York is driven by making sure that that nation-leading climate law is fully funded and fully implemented. So that's not a sure thing. We know that like getting a law signed is just half the battle. And in Massachusetts, one thing we're really excited about is developing in partnership with dozens of other organizations the possibility of a clean energy equity provision similar to what New York did potentially, as well as making sure that regulatory processes are accountable to the public and as inclusive and equitable as possible, like Yara mentioned in the Interior West. We also have my Mid-Atlantic counterpart on the call, Elowen, who's been doing some awesome work making sure that New Jersey's community solar program has best practices for serving low-income households. So that's really exciting to see codified into law. And I will turn it over to Lindsay, who is the Deputy Program Director for the Southeast.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for being here today. So last but definitely not least is the Southeast. Like Elena said, I manage our team down here, and we work in Georgia, Florida, South Carolina, and North Carolina. And so when we talk about environmental justice, a lot of the movements that we would consider, environmental justice movements have origins in the Southeast, with communities organizing on issues of toxic waste and water and air quality concerns. And this is actually a picture from the movement that Sach mentioned in his introduction earlier. And so in these cases, a lot of them have been directly tied with energy decision-making and the impacts of fossil fuels. So for example, in North Carolina, when you have toxic waste in landfills, runoff can pollute the water sources that provide drinking water to communities. In Louisiana, of course, there's Cancer Alley, which adversely impacts communities of color and is also related to the oil and gas industry. And so when we look at environmental justice in the past, it has already been about energy decision-making, but a lot of it's been about the impacts of fossil fuels. And so when we talk about organizing and activating a base and a movement around clean energy, in the Southeast so far, the outcomes are a bit mixed. So when you look at, solar, especially in Georgia and North Carolina, you'll often see that they have some of the most solar in the country. A lot of this is utility scale and owned by investor-owned utilities. And so it's good for the grid that we're getting more clean energy onto the grid, but we are working to try and increase distributed energy resources. So trying to increase rooftop solar, trying to increase community solar, microgrids, clean energy that would give residents and businesses in the Southeast an opportunity to have more control over the energy that they use and to have cleaner air in the communities where they live. Can you go to the next slide? So the first kind of case study that I want to talk about in our work is actually the work we're doing right now in Eastern North Carolina. We're partnering with a number of organizations, but I did want to highlight the work that Power the Vote, NC, and the Robeson County Cooperative for Sustainable Development is doing. We just hired on a new position in our team, and he is actually working on organizing and building power in Eastern North Carolina. Eastern North Carolina is home to the state's Black Belt, and it's also home to communities that have really been largely forgotten in some of the organizing work that environmental groups have been doing over time. So we started noticing that there was really a lot of communities that just didn't have a seat at the table, and that these voices were really important because they represented groups that are adversely impacted by fossil fuels. They represent communities that have some of the highest bill burdens in the state. And they also represent communities that are in floodplains. So they're also the most at risk when it comes to the extreme weather events that we're seeing from climate change. So to try and reach out to some of these communities and understand what kind of interest they have in organizing around clean energy and what issues are most important to them, we've been partnering with these groups to hold a series of meetings across Eastern North Carolina and making sure that we intersect with groups that work on voting rights, that work on housing rights, that work on economic development, because all of this intersects with energy and how people engage with state level decision making. So our goal this year is to train advocates from communities of color, to meet new advocates from communities of color, from rural communities and low-income communities, and to help them claim their spot at the table at the Utilities Commission or at the legislature and demand energy justice for their communities and whatever that looks like. So talking with them about what issues are most important for them and really lifting those up and supporting them, and just making sure that the commission knows that equity is critical in a clean energy transition. And there's really not a good clean energy transition without that. So can we go to the next slide? The second case study that I wanted to highlight was the work that we're doing in Georgia. Some of you may be aware that Georgia Power is seeking a 40% rate increase this year over a series of different dockets. So really what we're trying to do is connect clean energy and the opportunities that come with clean energy with bill affordability and energy burden in decision makers' eyes. So this year in the legislative session, we worked with Georgia conservation voters and a coalition of other EJ partners around the state to just meet members of the Georgia legislature and to meet other decision makers to raise awareness of the energy bill burden that we already see, and then to make sure that they know that Georgia Power is asking for a significant rate increase that will only put more burden on low income and communities of color. After that, we talked about just kind of linking the fact that fossil fuels, they're not just dirty, but they're often very expensive and they put more pressure on rates. And on top of that, Georgia Power actually over collects the revenue that it's supposed to collect. And so we're working on a bill that would use those funds to make clean energy more accessible, and it would actually use those funds and put it into a different pot of money that could be used to help low-income communities access clean energy. And so our goal in Georgia right now is just to help low-income households save money on their bill. We know that they're facing huge bill burdens, and to also start putting in policies around net metering, access to clean energy, to make sure that decision makers and ratepayers know that with more solar, they'd be able to have more control over the energy that they use and be able to reduce the money that they pay each month. Last slide. Finally, what's next? I know for sure in the Southeast that more clean energy is coming. And the reasons why are that there's just so many reasons that we have to transition to clean energy. So we obviously in the Southeast, we have a lot of hurricanes. We have a big floodplain problem. And so we know that clean energy, especially distributed energy resources, help folks retain power even when there's more outages. We know that clean energy and rooftop solar in particular can help with bill burden. We also see a lot of companies moving to the Southeast. So a lot of folks are moving to the Southeast. And so those companies, they have clean energy goals of their own. And so we're working with them to try and align our work to make sure that decision makers know that it's not just residents who want clean energy, it's also the new companies that are coming and bringing jobs. And then finally, we also have a lot of local government goals that are being set by cities and counties across the region. So we're teaming up with a lot of sustainability managers at the municipal level to make sure that decision makers know that cities and counties want this too. I also see that more people are joining the energy conversation. So they're demanding for democratic decision-making in energy spaces, just like they're demanding for more democracy in voting spaces and housing spaces. So people are starting to link up the idea that democracy needs to happen in all of the different areas that impact our lives. And then finally, I'm just starting to see a lot of people understand that low-income communities of color were more impacted by fossil fuel pollution and continue to be than white communities, than wealthier communities. And so people are starting to understand that as we go to clean energy, we have to make sure that we're incorporating, workforce opportunities, we're incorporating cleanup requirements, we're incorporating all the things that would allow those communities to achieve justice for the pollution and the negative impacts that they've experienced over the decades of fossil fuel use. And I think I will pass it back to Emerald now.
Hi again, everyone. Thank you, Andrea, Yara, John, Elena, and Lindsay. We already have several questions from the audience. So the first one is, where can we learn more details about how community solar is being implemented, how it works, and what challenges have been seen? So community solar is being implemented all over the country, but I'm going to begin asking Lindsay if you want to provide some details on community solar.
Yeah, sure. Community solar is an issue that we're actually working on right now in North Carolina. In the Southeast, community solar is not thriving as much as it should be thriving. And so we're working on communicating that to decision makers and trying to bring especially Duke Energy back to the table to create a policy and a program that would allow new developments of community solar to pencil out. So that's definitely something that's on our radar. It's something we're seeing more and more people demand as they discover solar for the first time. So I think one of the best things that you can do is, reach out to me after the webinar. And, if you're interested in learning about a particular state or a particular city or a particular utility, I'd be happy to give you more information on what's available in that area.
Thank you. Any of our other panelists want to talk about community solar? Okay, move to the next one. John, I'm going to have you answer this one. Can you talk about finding jobs in the solar industry?
Yeah, if you are interested in working in solar, a solar company is definitely interested in finding you. The solar industry is just booming writ large, especially with some of the federal legislation that we've seen pass in the last year and a half. And so there are a lot of different training programs, in part largely to retrain the workforce. We do have people who are leaving fossil fuel careers and are interested in staying in the energy sector. And so there are some programs that are very specific to folks that are transitioning careers or trying to retool. There's also additional initiatives that we've seen, certainly in the Midwest, to focus on the communities left behind in the fossil fuel economy. And so with CEJA, the Climate and Equitable Jobs Act in Illinois, we created this big statewide network of workforce development hubs that are designed to identify folks who are looking for training, to connect them with the local training program. And there's even additional funding to provide some wraparound support. So if folks need travel stipends, if they need childcare, if they need something to help them get that first foot in the door of the clean energy economy, those programs are there. Not every state has those, but I guarantee that every state has some degree of a solar training program that is either run through perhaps a local labor union or is run by a local nonprofit or NGO or through a community college. So it might take a little Googling, but I promise that there is a job out there for you and anyone else who wants to work in solar.
I would like to add that IBEW Local 11 here in Los Angeles has a training center. So they will actually pay you to train and then will get you a union job in renewable energy, especially solar. And then Grid Alternatives also has a program to train you and get you jobs in solar. So there are plenty of opportunities.
And then our Energy Justice awardee this past year is the director of an organization called We Act in New York, and they also do solar training and workforce training. So lots of great opportunities out there. Elena, this one is for you. How can we advocate for rooftop solar, removing barriers for community solar or renters, since so much rooftop solar is a homeowner decision?
I would answer in two ways. One is yes, it is a homeowner decision to put rooftop solar on your home. But a lot of what we do is to try to make that decision one that people can make regardless of their income level. So focusing on low-income homeowners is something that we try to do and make sure that there are sort of equitable incentive levels and that people know how to access different credits and programs to help get solar on your roof. So that's one way to advocate. And I think you're going to get a link at the end of this call for a way to push for that in your state. And was the other part of it went away. Was the other part of the question about multifamily and renter homes?
Yes, community solar renters.
Yeah, so that kind of depends on the state, but we have definitely in the Northeast and Mid-Atlantic a lot of campaigns that are in different stages. For instance, Pennsylvania does not yet have community solar. So what we're advocating for there is the introduction of a community solar program. In New York, we're advocating for more community-owned solar. So it sort of depends on where you live, what the market looks like, and how advanced and equitable the program is. But speaking as someone who works in a legislative capacity, I'll say that legislators love to hear from constituents. Your voice as a constituent means a lot more than mine as an advocate. So you can, sign up for our newsletter in whatever state that you live in, and make sure that you get plugged into opportunities to speak with your legislator and talk about what it would mean for you and your neighbors to have good access to community solar and rooftop solar.
Thank you. I just dropped a link into the chat. So as Elena described, we have quick action pages to allow you to easily send an email, a tweet, or a call to your legislators. And we draft a sample email for you to make it easy. We do recommend that you personalize this message, but that's there for you to take easy access to advocate for this work. Our next question, this might be the last one depending on how long it takes to answer, is directed to Yara. Are there any campaigns targeting solar on schools or with school districts, especially with the emphasis on Title I schools and solar in the IRA?
Yes, absolutely. That's a great question, Anna. So in the Interior West region, there are quite a few efforts from different environmental justice organizations really working to advocate and to advance the rapid deployment of solar and just clean energy in Title I schools. For example, one that comes to mind is CHISPA. CHISPA is an environmental justice organization. They're pretty active here in the Interior West, and they recently were pushing for what their campaign was called a Clean Buses for Healthy Niños campaign. And so this was electrifying school buses in Title I schools and ensuring that these school buses are being charged by solar panels. Clark County in Nevada is also looking at solar parking with storage to help charge electrical vehicle school buses. And there are grants. So I think the deadline for these grants has already passed by, but with the Inflation Reduction Act, there are a lot of different opportunities for Title I schools to apply and make sure that they're accessing the many benefits and resources and all of the money, right, that comes down for solar and EVs in their schools. And I'm also happy to connect and dive a little more into it if you have questions about it in the Interior West. And I know that Ella also flagged another campaign in the chat and put her email address in the chat as well.
Thank you. So unfortunately, those are all the questions that we can accept currently. However, we will be sending out contact information after this and the recording. So then you can ask the panelists your questions there. So I want to say thank you again to our incredible panelists and all of you who joined today. We hope you found this webinar informative and inspiring. And now that you're feeling energized, go and take action with that link that I put in there. We'll also be sharing that link afterwards. You can find more information and resources about Vote Solar on our homepage and social media pages. We're on Facebook, LinkedIn, Instagram, and Twitter. We'll also be sending those resources in the follow-up email. We encourage all of you to stay engaged with energy justice and take action in your communities to promote solar adoption. Thank you all and have a great rest of your day.